Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a returning guest, somebody a lot of people enjoy. Malcolm here he wanted to talk a little bit. He just released a new essay about critical race theory and whether it should be banned or how the right should be approaching this topic. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about his thoughts about what Curtis Yarvin has said about it, Chris Ruffo, and then kind of how the right should be approaching it, at least in his view. So, Malcolm, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think this essay, someone in my position, you kind of write some things just because you have to pay the bills, right? And then you write some things because it's an interesting topic and there's nice ideas to explore. And then some things you write because your bitch muse is telling you that unless you finish this fucking thing by tomorrow evening, she's going to file for a divorce. You just kind of have to do it. You just kind of have to get it out there. And this was sort of one of those pieces that I just kind of had to get through. Because this is an incredibly, the issue of CRT is actually incredibly fascinating. You're familiar with Curtis Jarvin's take on this, right? That basically you should never underestimate the capacity for conservatism and conservative ink to fuck things up. And they're going to succeed this time as well, right?
Yeah, probably good to set the stage a little bit for people who are unfamiliar with that back and forth. So obviously we have Chris Ruffo out there, and he's been very embraced by the right wing. He's kind of been out there, pushing against CRT, especially inside institutions, and he's doing something, to be fair, that conservatives haven't seen for a long time, which is he looks like he's actually taking a few scalps, right? You're seeing legislation get passed. You're seeing executive orders written. You're seeing declarations from certain people go out, and this feels like a win for people who are kind of dying of thirst in the desert.
And that's kind of why people who usually like Curtis Yarvin have been sort of, I don't know about this one, Chief, because I think a lot of people interpret his criticism, which on one level, it's kind of hard to deny a lot of the points. But on the other level, it's you're never going to win the lottery unless you actually buy a ticket.
Yeah, and that's the thing with Yarvin, right? Like the problem is, obviously I'm somebody who's done quite a few videos on his work. I think he's generally right. And the funny thing about Yarvin is that on a long enough timeline, he usually is right. We had a lot of people who kind of agreed with him, but then when the Trump election came around in 2020, they kind of made that big push with Trump because it's the last chance, and then they kind of Yarvin caught a lot of heat for what he said about Trump and what he said about making that play, and then at the end, kind of everything he said that was going to happen ended up happening. And it's one of those things where if you're betting against conservatives winning in America, you'll probably be right, but it's not really a great plan for action. So I think that's often how it's seen.
Yeah, and so what really sort of forced me to throw my hat into the ring, as it were, was that you kind of read this criticism by Jarvin, and you say, well, he's not wrong on these specific points, and you can pretty much never be wrong when you bet that conservatism Inc. will fuck things up. You're always going to win. But on the other hand, even sort of totaling that, you kind of get the feeling that there's something here missing. That it's not that necessarily conservatives know what they're doing, but there's something deeper buried here that is actually sort of politically, historically, socially meaningful. And so I found myself in the position of essentially agreeing with Curtis Yarvin's points on a lot of the actual sort of specific things he was pointing out, but also thinking that, none of these points are actually going to matter, or at least there's a chance of them not mattering in the end. Like, conservatism might actually get a win without really understanding why here.
Yeah, well, I guess then let's go ahead and dive into some of the, outlining what you were saying here at the beginning, because I did read most of your essay, and I certainly agreed with parts of it, but I think we'll probably part ways in a few specific areas. But why don't you just kind of lay out your case as to kind of what CRT is and what function it serves, and kind of go from there.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing you have to begin with is sort of in my view, pretty conceited and like completely delusional self-image that the right and parts, especially of the radical right, have about themselves. Like, I think that self-image is completely bogus. And not to put too fine a point on it, but in my experience, a lot of people on the right are like completely comfortable with saying that, yeah, we're not super great on the economy. Like, you have all of these Marxists and, I don't know, like economists and eggheads on the other side. And they probably, with their like profane materialism, they probably have some insights into, how the economy impacts people. But we on the right, we have this thing we specialize in, and that is culture. Like, you can't talk to us about the economy, but damn, do we know culture? Like, no, that is...
I would say that's almost the opposite, especially in the mainstream right.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the mainstream right, sure, you can still have this sort of, oh, well, these communists, they don't know that communism doesn't work or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's the dominating narrative, is that the right loses the culture war but wins economically, which I disagree with on a couple different levels. But I think that's the going, like general consensus in, political circles.
Yeah, though that has begun to change now that sort of... I think it's slightly more complicated, at least like among the sort of radical intellectual set. Like, maybe I just travel in the wrong circles, but I do see a lot of people essentially saying that my interest is in the realm of the cultural, and that is where I sort of put all of my my intellectual chops. But what I would say to that is just that the interesting thing about sort of partaking in the debates about critical race theory, as one example that rage on the right, is that like the right is not quite as stupid as the sort of cultural materialism that you find on the left, especially among like dogmatic Marxists, which is essentially just people saying that, oh, well, you have all of these gang rapes in England. Why do they happen? Well, it's because the state hasn't paid out like £300 or whatever in social welfare. If the state would only pay these rapists like £300, like there would be no gang rape, because culture is material. And then, the state pays out £300, and these materialists then say, oh, no, I never said £300. I meant £600. If you pay out £600, there will be no gang rape. But the problem with the right, and from my perspective at least, it's just that what you get instead is this kind of sort of free-floating voluntarism in a way. So why do we have CRT? Well, because it's anti-white. You just have a bunch of radicals who hate white people. It's like, you have this remote control and you have like 100 different channels. And the channel you're seeing, the culture that is dominating all of these sort of important institutions, well, my sister or brother or boomer parent or whatever just decided on a whim to press like button 99 instead of 54. And, well, this is not a very good way to understand like what CRT is about. CRT and culture in general is not something that you can sort of boil down to, well, if you have $400, you have this culture. If you have $800, you get this culture. It's all about the money. But also, it's not something that people pick at random. Like, it's constrained cultural mores have to be useful to people. And CRT, if you talk to people on the right, they generally sort of underestimate or want to ignore all the ways that CRT is actually sort of a critical component in the functioning of our current system, more or less.
Yeah, so I think there's stuff to agree with there and stuff to disagree with there. I 100% agree that the functionality of CRT has not been properly understood by the right. And you'll go a little, hopefully you'll go a little more in depth like you did in your essay and talk about that a little more so we can flesh that a little more. I will say that there's probably something to push back a little bit with saying you are right to say that CRT has not been selected simply for its anti-whiteness. It is that is a component of it. It's something that is useful and that therefore gets applied. But I do think you want to, if you want to sell this, and yeah, I don't know if you're in the realm of selling this, but if you want to sell this to people on the right, I think you want to be careful of just completely dismissing that aspect because it sounds so much like kind of the song and dance that they get so often saying, well, the real problem with CRT is that it's actually racist against Asians, and that's where you should fight against. You know what I mean? Like it's this is kind of the I forget what the woman who was trying to cancel people on the right because they were pointing out that CRT is anti-white, and she was saying no, the real problem is that it's racist against Black people and Asian people. That's where you have to fight it. It's generally probably better to acknowledge that is a real component of that, but then go on to explain why and why that's not maybe the major function or the main function. That's probably going to get you further, simply because it just, like I said, it sounds like that rhetorical thing that the right hears so often of, well, no, you don't really need to worry about people saying that you're evil. Like, that's not the real problem. The real problem is that, it disadvantages some other group.
Look, there's a lot of these kind of bullshit arguments going around. Like, no, you should be against CRT because we need more Jews at Harvard or whatever. Like, please give more money to my group. And stop pointing out whatever it is you care about the thing I care about. That's not really my concern. The issue here is not necessarily that, the right should be spending more energy on sort of helping this or this group that I care about. I think that the right should stop deluding itself and sort of papering over facts that are disruptive to the fairly comfortable but probably oversimplified theory of this whole sort of cultural nexus. And by that, I just mean that, well, like, if it picture a sort of normal ethnic conflict. So you're in India, you have Hindus on one side, and you have Muslims on the other. The way an ethnic conflict looks between different sort of discrete ethnic groups is that on the Hindu side, the foot soldiers are Hindu, the generals are Hindu, the sergeants are Hindu, and the people being killed are Muslim. And then sort of flip that around for the other side. You will never find a situation like an ethnic conflict between groups where the generals are Hindu, sort of the victims are the foot soldiers are Muslims, the victims are mostly Hindu, and like so on and so on. And then you have like these Hindu generals telling their Muslim foot soldiers, "Oh my God, this Muslim dog insulted me. You have to kill him in the name of, I don't know, Islam." Like, no, there's obviously something fairly unique going on here. And just as sort of the losers of this ideology are often white, the winners of this ideology also tend to be white. Like, what you sort of have to realize, and here people like Andrew Yang and so on who stress the impact this has on Asians are correct to do so. What you kind of have to realize is that the negative effects of CRT do disproportionately hit some groups. And again, like, this is a result not of, white people at the top, white people who want their kids to get into Harvard, sort of being, self-hating or whatever. It's just that, competition to get into Harvard is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And so the people standing in the way of that have to be taken off the board. And the practical sort of effect, and this is one aspect of wokeness that I think people on the right actually sort of usually underestimate. You know what people said about Donald Trump? Like liberals, they looked at Donald Trump and they never took him seriously, but they sort of hung on every phrase and always sort of tried to interpret him in the most literal way possible. And then they couldn't understand why people actually like Donald Trump, because if you interpret him in the most literal way possible, there's very little there to like. But like in terms of sort of who wins and who loses on when it comes to CRT, skin color is not really the prime factor. Like it's just not. If you try to join one of these institutions, you will find that out very quickly, because like officially, that is 100% the case. Like if you're black from the ghetto, you should just get a top spot at Harvard immediately because you're the most oppressed person. But that's like saying that, in the Soviet Union, if you go to the store, like there's so much stuff there that you can buy for no cost at all. It's not like in the decadent capitalist West where workers can't afford anything. The issue here is just that take the word Latinx, right? Latinx, or however you're supposed to pronounce this. This is a term that has no support among Latino people. If you are a Latino, CRT activist, white people are essentially telling you that you, as a Latinx, you have to sort of use these words, and if you don't, you can fuck off. If people are capable of giving one ethnic group orders, marching orders, telling them like this is my way or the highway, like something is going on here that needs to be examined.
Yeah, so I mean, I said something similar to what you're saying in a tweet that kind of blew up, which was that that white people who support CRT aren't self-hating; they see themselves as a separate class.
Yeah.
And so this is a mechanism to remove themselves from those that to sort them out, which is something that you go into depth into in the essay. Which I think is your best point. So why don't you explain a little bit what you mean by CRT as like a solution for the overproduction of elites?
Well, I mean, the problem right now that the US is facing, and this is pretty obvious, is that competition for like elite spots at journalism, top colleges, stuff like that is just completely out of whack. This is one thing that's actually connected to crashing fertility rates as well. Because again, if you belong to the upper middle class, one of the most sort of socially important things that you have to do when you reproduce yourself, like your family, your genes over the generations, is to make sure that your kid doesn't end up, sleeping in a Hoover wheel or whatever. So the problem is that over time, the costs of actually sort of paying for school and, all of the rituals you have to jump through in order to stay in your upper middle class have just sort of everything is more expensive and more difficult, and there's more sort of takers for every chair. And what this leads to is just that what Turchin calls like elite competition or elite overproduction sort of disrupts the culture in more and more ways. And the nice thing about CRT that you sort of have to understand are not just like randomly arrived at or driven out of spite, is that CRT as an intellectual system is actually sort of a way to duel other people, in the sense that if you are a master at CRT, like, being some sort of Shaolin monk or whatever who knows like Dragon Fang Kung Fu, a master of CRT can be like a lily white sort of Anglo-Saxon person who's been part of a elite Boston family that came on the Mayflower, say, and, you know, lecture a sort of war veteran black janitor, telling him he's a fucking racist piece of shit that should die. And the right looks at this and says, oh, well, this is a really confused system. Like, why don't these white people understand that they're being sort of hypocritical or confused about what they're doing? No, like, this is the point. And this is not something particularly new in a culture. Like, if you go back to, I don't know, the Victorian era, and you will find out that, like, there's no sort of list of table manners that is objective, like it's posted on a signpost or something. And if you're just some random worker, you can read all of these rules, and then, you know, you can just follow them, and cool, now you can go to the country club. No, actually, rules in this sort of gatekeeping class sense always have to be constantly shifting and inherently contradictory, so that people can apply the rules that fit the moment in order to exclude others. And the more competition you have at the top, the more this sort of exclusionary function of culture comes to the fore.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that it is a sorting mechanism. It is something that could be wielded, like I said, to cancel people who would be otherwise competing for status. And so if you learn the correct rules, if you learn how to navigate the civic religion properly, then you can rise and your enemies will fall. I think all of that's true, and I think all of that's useful, and something that the right needs to keep in mind when they're deciding what to push back against and how, and if it can even be pushed back against. The question that a lot of people, I think, on the right are going to ask is then, why is the mechanism of class navigation, why is this mechanism of cancellation so explicitly pointed towards, obviously, a historically white nation and people inside that nation? I think the answer is relatively obvious, but if you have, I think, the average right winger, that's what they're going to ask you. You know, to your point, is why then this sorting mechanism? Why is this the one? Why is this the battlefield? Why have they found this to be the useful one to cancel their enemies and elevate themselves and move themselves into positions in places like Harvard?
Well, I mean, I think there were a couple of possible alternatives, and there was nothing sort of fated that race should be the sort of issue of the day. Because again, the same people that today say that America is a horrifically fantastically racist country, all white people are super bad and should be killed, you know, wearing kente cloth or whatever the fuck. These people were saying 15 years ago that, no, actually, like, if you say that the US is a horribly racist country, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, we've solved all of these problems. Like, again, I'm not saying the same people in some sort of, well, they look the same, kind of. I'm talking about the exact same individuals. So Nancy Pelosi, for example, she's gone through a couple of different sort of iterations of elite ideology at this point. And this is just like the latest of a long set of different sort of elite commitments. I don't think she's experiencing any sort of acute cognitive dissonance or like feelings of being a race traitor or whatever. I think this is just a new thing now. And the other thing that makes like race so exceedingly convenient is because, again, like, there are obviously conflicts here. And these conflicts can then be exploited in ways that are fairly self-serving. So it's not like, and this rarely happens in nature, like nature deciding upon like, oh, well, today I'm going to invent a bird. and I'm gonna invent the bird from whole cloth, just take a bunch of parts, custom build them or whatever. Like, birds are just sort of outgrowths of lizards, which are themselves just outgrowths of something else. So like, evolution, both in the biological and ideological sense, is a series of happy accidents in a lot of ways. And again, like, the problem here is also one where, like, white people, in the sense of, how people use the term, like, the white working class, like, white people who are used to having some sort of political representation or having their concerns being taken seriously in like previous generations of the American body politics. These are like the biggest threats. So it's not incorrect in some ways to say that, like, this is an anti-white ideology. It's just that this is predicated not on some immutable, like, 23andMe test, but just in terms of, the actual ethnicity on the ground in areas that are now being fucked over politically and economically, and have to be, like, in the words of parts of the right, like, you need to euthanize, you need to kill all of these people because they're sort of a drag on the economy.
Well, and so this is where I think, and I think that's something that's important to acknowledge, while also making the point that it's not the overall motivating factor. So I think this is where we'll agree and overlap, is that the target and the mechanism they're using is simply because it, like you said, it removes people who are not necessarily useful from the power structure. It gatekeeps the right type of people. It removes power from the right type of people. If those people were any other color, they'd probably be fine with targeting that group too. It serves a useful function, and that is the people that they're targeting with that function at the moment. But yeah, that's all. Is I just wanted to clarify that, because I think that is where you'll get hung up with what I think your analysis is overall correct, but I just want to clarify that is a point you will get hung up with a lot of the right, if it's not made clear as to why you're saying that, because like I said, they're so used to that rhetoric being avoided or shunted or redirected, and it's hard for them to see past that often.
Yeah, there's actually an interesting thing in terms of, like, the more radical right's relationship to race, which I find fascinating, even though people eventually tend to end up on the side of reason here. What's his name? Like, the fucking Norwegian death metal wizard,
sorry.
What is his name? God. The guy with the long beard who just types a bunch of shit on Twitter, and who killed a guy over sort of Gandalf the White or whatever. God, I need to.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have enough knowledge of the circle here to help you out.
Oh yeah, Fuel and Perspective. The what is his name?
Varg is there.
Varg
Vikernes.
Yeah, this guy is really fascinating, because he's a sort of true believer, to the point of, like, just being sort of a crazy hermit out in the desert, or out on some fjord in this case. So Varg Vikernes will occasionally say stuff like, I'm a racist, and, like, you sort of losers who think you're, like, white nationalists, but you aren't really. Like, I approach this stuff scientifically. And then he says something, like, completely off the wall, like, using my powers of racist deduction, I will tell you Swedes that the Moroccan sort of vagrant children that are robbing you, they're actually white. Like, and this is not me saying so. This is, like, objective race science, okay? Like, you can't argue with it. The Moroccans are white, but all of these sort of Iranian doctors or whatever are just sort of race. They don't belong to the same racial family. You have to kick out the dentists, and you have to accept the sort of rapists and murderers. And everyone will just go, I don't think so, buddy. Like, maybe not. But imagine if you were sort of a really committed, fanatical believer in the immutability of race science, and God himself, or Adolf Hitler, or whoever, like the ultimate authority of these things, parted the clouds and said all of these sort of vagrants and highway robbers and so on, like they're your comrades. But the people that you go to the dentist office to get them to sort of fix your teeth or whatever, like, no, kick them out. Most people would then say that, there is a sort of political reality here in the Schmittian sense, right? Friend-enemy distinction. And whatever this God of race science tells me, I know which people I like and which people I do not like. And so if I'm to embrace rapists and tell, productive friends and members of society to fuck off, I will make an exception from my deeply held belief in this particular case. This is how everyone reacts when Varg Vikernes is honest crap. And, this is a sort of healthy impulse, but it's not just sort of ethnic nationalists that can have this. This is like the rule of the realm when it comes to wokeness. People have a sort of preformed political interest opinion. And at that point, they sort of hew to that rather than going with like the sort of following their ideology to the end. And if you don't realize that, like, this is how most people approach ideology, like you are going to sort of fool yourself about what the stakes often are.
Yeah, so now that we understand kind of what you're saying about CRT and its what its use is, especially with the elite classes, what's the prescriptive aspect of this? So I think part of this was explaining CRT, but it's also, okay, what should the right then be doing? Jarvin, obviously, we got a couple camps. We've got the Ruffo camp, which is, we're going to pick this up and, we're going to run with it, and we're going to, slay this dragon. We're going to get this banned. We're going to, take action, formal action with government, and drive this out of companies. You've got people who say Ruffo doesn't go far enough. He's not willing to have the right kind of rhetoric. And then you've got kind of got the Jarvin position, which is, you can't actually win this battle, and expending the level of energy here necessary is going to, is either going to burn you out or feed the system rather than move the ball. So what then, with kind of what you're saying with CRT, what is the prescriptive aspect here?
I think that the thing that you sort of have to realize here is that there is seemingly a growing sort of popular groundswell around this crap. Like, people are flabbergasted by the crap they're being taught in schools, and they hate this. They want to do something about this. I think that you don't really have to change much about what you're doing, but you should have some sort of humility about like what is actually happening. Because my argument here, my sort of essential analysis, and I think there's something to be said for it, is that the elite in the US have only one way to solve their problems. And their big problem today is that there's not enough resources being diverted in order to maintain the elite. And by the way, this is kind of why, like, all of these attempts to get the good guys in, like, we're going to put some conservatives on the Supreme Court, and then, like, it's just a clown show. Like, nothing is done. The judges that, like, I wouldn't bet money on this, but I certainly wouldn't bet money against it, that the judges that Trump put in did actually more to undermine him, especially towards the end with like all the fraud crap, than, the judges that Obama put in. So, like, there's a lot of talk about we need to retake the institutions, and then you sort of realize that the people being put in by conservatives are even like worse than people being put in by liberals 10 years ago. But the issue here is just that all of these sort of institutions where these people come from are facing enormous pressures because these people have kids and junior needs to get a decent job and there's not enough of them to go around. So what CRT aims to do is not just, brainwash kids into hating white people, because the people brainwashing them will be white people, and the people making bank off of this sick industry will be white people a lot of the time. Like, not always, but like they're certainly not suffering. I don't know how much that, what her name is, like white fragility, like that.
D'Angelo. Yeah, that was the first person I was going to say. Yeah, D'Angelo's not hurting right now.
Yeah, she's charging like $10,000 an hour or something, giving speeches. I don't think she feels any threatened by sort of the long march of this ideology. But not everyone can be D'Angelo. There's a lot of struggling folks out there who struggle to charge even $100. And this is where Joe Biden and the federal government is supposed to step in. And the solution that like the proponents of CRT wish for ends up being a sort of increased centralization and increased bureaucratization of the United States school system. So the parents going to these school boards meetings are not just a threat because, they're white racists, they have the wrong ideology, we need to teach them to have the right ideology. It doesn't fucking matter what ideology they have. The problem is that you can't have parents going to school boards, letting parents decide what their children learn. You need to sort of make that into a function of the political system that only highly educated and highly paid professionals can do anything about.
Yeah, I think understanding it as a mechanism of power and expansion of that power to keep up that lifestyle and secure kind of a future and income stream and power stream for that class is certainly the way to understand it. So if that's the case, like you said, that they don't need to change much about what they're doing about fighting it. Let me grab, there was a super chat up here from Charlemagne earlier. Charlemagne said, a big significant positive in trying to ban CRT is conservatives coming to the realization that the enemy ideas must be destroyed rather than debated. So I guess, one of the big, pushbacks, and blessedly there's less of this on the right than there ever has been, but there's still the David Frenches out there that are like, no, you can't stop people from teaching this ideology. That's free speech. If we know that the current push is to ban this, but you're saying the biggest problem is that the people who are preaching it are going to continue using it because it's kind of this way to secure power, then what is the proper approach? Is it to continue to try to ban it? Is it to try to decentralize these apparatuses? Is that possible, or do they simply collapse under their own weight and then you move on? What do you think?
I think that the super chat is onto something. The only sort of criticism I would make of that statement is that it doesn't go quite far enough. I mean, if you're some sort of boomer conservative and you want to sort of replace all of these kooky identity politics ideas with patriotism, let's just say, I mean, you still would need a patriotism that allows people going to Harvard to sort of ruthlessly cancel other people going to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just march into these institutions and say, well, it's patriotism now. That's the idea of the right, and just play along, kids. No, if you have all of these pressures of elite overproduction, even a good idea such as patriotism will be perverted by these sort of incentives and turn into something fairly sort of damaging to the social fabric of the American Republic, let's just say. Like, patriotism will become some sort of nightmare monster, just as sort of a Prussian testing system in South Korea has become this,
way to destroy the childhood of everyone born there.
Yeah, I mean, like, you would do better putting children in a sort of communist, like, Soviet labor camp or something at this point, because, like, the hours would be shorter. But that's not necessarily the fault of, having standardized tests. Like, you can have standardized tests without being an inhuman dystopia. But if you have this sort of stagnation, like nobody can get a job, like the inhuman dystopia will arrive sooner or later. So to sort of make a long story short, maybe the right should not try to destroy these ideas, because whatever they replace them with will pick up the same sort of anti-human uses. Maybe they should be destroying liberals as such, not liberal ideas. Maybe this sounds a bit too radical, but it's a thought, because if you sort of destroy not just these people saying stuff that you disagree with, but the sort of institutions and pressures that create these ideas, you'll actually have solved the problem in a way. But obviously, like, actually sort of fighting them, denying them getting something that they want, in this case, the destruction of the current federal political system and sort of the ability for a parent in West Virginia to have any influence over what children in West Virginia learn at school. If you deny them that prize, you're actually doing something fairly useful, even if the perspective of, well, I'm going to prove their ideas wrong and then things will improve, even if that is fanciful and naive.
Yeah, I guess so. Obviously, as somebody who, again, is generally on board with Jarvin's points, obviously, the need to cut this out at the root at the institutional level and kind of pull it out of the consensus making apparatus is, I think, key. But the question, of course, is always how, right? When you don't have that institutional power, how do you assail those things? Entryism doesn't seem like an option because they're just going to cancel you out. Like you're not going to get a lot of right wingers entering the educational system and taking over departments. And so what do you do then to attack those power bases in those institutions? How can you leverage that?
Well, I mean, there's good news and bad news here. The good news is that, like, no matter how incompetent you are, it's not gonna be a huge detriment to the success of your political project. The bad news is that the reason, like, your own incompetence or powerlessness is not gonna necessarily hurt you is because this is a sort of out of control runaway train heading for a cliff wall, and the brakes are out of water, and kind of have to prepare for the crash in a way. Like, I don't say this as some sort of ridiculous accelerationist who thinks that tomorrow we'll all be fighting with sticks and stones and bartering for pig heads or whatever. But the problem here is that this sort of imposition of CRT everywhere is obviously incredibly unpopular and damaging to sort of the political fabric of the United States. And conservatives are not wrong about these ideas being, hateful in the eyes of ordinary people. I'm not saying that you shouldn't care about the fact that this is an anti-human ideology because ideologies don't matter. Like, that's not what I'm saying at all. But the problem is that, like, there's obviously some desperation at play here. At the end of the Ottoman Empire, succession was just a mess a lot of the time. So, you have this guy, he has this harem and has like 40 sons or whatever. And obviously, with sort of the open succession order, as I think it's called, where you don't have the oldest kid inheriting. You have the kid that is the strongest and has the most support. If you have like 40 sons or whatever, the succession, the changeover of power, usually entailed the various sons that really wanted to win, basically, selling parts of the Ottoman Empire at the local pawn shop in order to afford mercenaries and troops to kill their brothers. And there was a certain sense in doing this from the perspective of the individual sort of wannabe sultan. But in terms of, maintaining the Ottoman Empire over the generations,
Right.
there's obviously some pretty huge problems here.
Yeah, you're hitting conquest third law. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the CRT and what liberals are doing right now is essentially the same thing. Like, they're practicing sort of slash and burn agriculture on sort of the ancient redwood forest of the Republican American state. It's and the solutions at this point are so patently ridiculous. Like, just now, Joe Biden came out and said that, well, all Americans need 4 extra years of semi-mandatory schooling, like 2 years of preschool and 2 years of not mandatory but kind of mandatory free community college. The American educational system is a fucking mess. It's a train wreck. It's a disaster. And these clowns are telling you that they're going to take more of your money and put it, like, throwing good money after bad. It doesn't matter that this is a total catastrophe. You're going to be in it longer and pay for it.
Yeah, their only solutions are extensions of control, not anything that's going to... And so here's the thing. I agree with most of this because it's pretty much what people kind of in the neo-reactionary camp get yelled at about, right? Like, this is basically what we've been saying is like, look, the building's going to come down. And the best thing to do is just prepare, get out from under it, the collapse, or, be prepared for when it comes, because it's just going to come down under its own weight. And efforts to stop the collapse are just going to be, it's the wrong place to put your energy. And it sounds a lot like that's what you're saying is like, look, the people in charge are going to need to just keep cutting these deals and burning down parts of the country to keep power and keep expanding. And eventually, that can't go on forever. But so is there anything beyond like just being prepared for that situation, or?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about like the practical shape of what's to come, I think the January 6th kerfluffle is a pretty good indication of where things are headed. So January 6th is probably the shape of like this Keystone Cops show that sort of institutional conservatism is heading for. Because you have all of these people sort of throwing lit matches at a pile of oily rags and then going, holy shit, my eyebrows are gone. I burned myself. Like, how could this happen? This CRT thing is going to be the exact same thing. And that doesn't mean you should sort of passively sit and await the collapse. I think that organizing against this crap is actually a fairly sort of benign and productive way to spend your time. But you should be aware that it's not necessarily that, the camel is sort of irate because you just came with this sort of, have you read Moldbug? Like, please listen to my podcast. I have all of these sort of neo-reactionary ideas about the future of American society. And the camel just listens to you and goes, holy crap, this is so correct on an intellectual level. Yeah. Like, the camel is sort of losing its shit because there's too many straws on its back. If you approach it and say, well, there's too many straws on your back, Mr. American Camel, I will help you remove some of those straws. You are probably, you probably have sort of a firmer understanding and a better position of strength to sort of act politically from.
Yeah, this is one of the things Ruffo's gotten a lot of crap from the right, from kind of the more dissident right, because like he's not ideologically pure enough. And then this is something I've pushed back against with them, is saying like, you're not going to win by like aligning everyone's rhetoric or ideology properly. Like, that's not how this gets done. What you're looking for is people who can scrap and who can take victories off of your enemies. And so pushing back effectively is far more important. And so sitting there and trying to preach a specific ideology to people is not going to be how you win. It's getting those practical victories, I think.
Yeah, and there's a bit of false consciousness here that I think I mentioned when we talked over Twitter before the show, which is that, like, at some point, people inside of the right has to drop this completely ridiculous notion that they're somehow part of a counter-revolution. Like, we can have different definitions of what a counter-revolution is, but when I think of a counter-revolution, I think like, Russia. You have the Bolsheviks. They sort of come as pirates. They usurp the political power of the state. And then the remnants of the old order sort of rally to say, well, you broke the apostolic succession. Now we have to take power back. That's a counter-revolution. That's not what the right is. The elites at the top of the current American Republic are the descendants of the elites 100 years ago. Sure, there's some sort of turnover, and maybe the turnover is slightly quicker today than it was. But you kind of have to realize that the same families that sort of ruled Boston and Philadelphia and, got into Harvard automatically because their uncle was sort of drinking buddies with the president of Harvard or whatever. Like, those people, their descendants, voluntarily switched the US system over to one that first said, well, okay, we are going to sort of accept people at Harvard using standardized testing because we have to be somewhat meritocratic now. It's going to be a bunch of Asians and maybe even a couple of black people, but, it's the 60s, okay? And then the descendants of those people that made that change, who also got into Harvard more or less automatically because of who they were, then said, well, okay, maybe there's too many Asians, actually. Maybe all of these damn gooks are a bit too good at these dumb standardized testing. Maybe it's time to get rid of that crap and use sort of Confucian wokeness essays instead. And maybe that will lead to some sort of enterprising kids from the ghetto, but not really. That's not how it works in reality. But at least some sort of ambitious black upper middle class people being accepted into Harvard slightly at a higher rate than the population, maybe. But at least all of these Asians will be gone, and this will be a practical solution to sort of the fact that our kids aren't getting in anymore. Like, at no point did a bunch of Bolsheviks come and say, hands over your head, like, we're changing the rules.
Yeah, just be careful. My YouTube channel is still, up. So
yeah, well,
let's keep it that way. I think that it is important for the right to understand that they are, and to be fair, this is something that kind of in our circles we've been trying to clarify with people, is that the counter revolution is the CRT. It is that's the stuff that's actually trying to like clamp down on any kind of pushback against the system. That this has been the ruling ideology for a long time.
Yeah.
And so this is just a continuation. This is just just revving up, as many people have pointed out, of ruling ideology that's been in place since at least the 50s and 60s and probably longer. And so trying to clamp down on the pushback, not the other way around. It's not a sudden thing that's popped up to take over your school system.
Yeah, I mean, you are a revolutionary. Like, you can pretend you're not, and that's a huge fucking cope. But at the end of the day, it's you. It's not Elizabeth Warren or Hillary Clinton who shows up one day and says, I don't like the way the elite sort of selects itself. I think we should change this by force if necessary, by reform if we can, because these elites, they're bad and I don't like them. These people are part of the elite, and they reached like this sort of clown show that is the current American like political dispensation by consensus. And I mean, if you don't like it, tough luck. Like, you're not part of the elite. like I saw this sort of tweet, and this is incredibly common, by the way, and it's also sort of a incredibly flattering but ultimately self-serving quote, which is what's his name? Pedro Gonzalez, a guy which I like, by the way, don't have a beef with. I think his political instincts are 99% of the time, or at least 9% out of 10, or 9 times out of 10, like on the money. But Pedro said something like, I was in a clubhouse debating CRT as an anti-white ideology, and it was me, sort of, whose parents are Mexican immigrants, and then there was this sort of Palestinian woman and some Asian, and we were all the ones like breathing fire and defending sort of Western civilization and the white civilization, whatever, against the WASPs who didn't really care. And there's 2 interpretations to this that you can have. The first interpretation is that the essence, the sort of blood, spirit, whatever of the white race is now flagging. So you have to have all of these auxiliaries. Like, it's up to the descendant of Mexican immigrants to sort of defend the white race because the white people have succumbed to, I don't know, tiredness or confusion or whatever. And that's why the WASPs in the clubhouse are, kind of non-committal or just shrug. They don't think CRT is very important. That's one interpretation, but it's also a fucking stupid one, if I'm being honest, because the alternate interpretation is that these WASPs who don't really care probably are a much better representation of the actual interests of the American WASP elite than like a bunch of immigrants. Maybe the immigrants are not necessarily sort of the defenders of the country club, but by virtue of being immigrants, they're actually on the outside trying to piss into the tent. And it makes a lot of sense if you have a sort of degenerate and evil elite, that people who aren't part about it should be really mad about it and say, well, this elite fucking sucks, like, let's do something about it. But if you convince yourself that what you're actually doing is defending these people because they don't have the sense to defend themselves, chances are you're actually sort of thinking you're something you're not. Like, it's much better at that point to say, well, of course these WASPs don't care because, they are the counter-revolutionaries, and I'm the ones that actually want to tear down their fucking country club in the first place because I think it sucks.
Let's go ahead and get Charlemagne here had a follow-up. He said, the battle of ideas is already lost. Conservatives cannot destroy the enemy's ideas, but realizing that it was a war you lost and not an honest debate is the first step to what the guest had said. Yeah.
I mean, sure. Like, that's the problem with all of these sort of ideas that, well, maybe if we make PragerU, like if random sort of plumbers in Arkansas or whatever send in more money to PragerU, we can have our own university, and then, we'll start the reconquest. We'll take back Harvard eventually from all of these liberal degenerates. Like, no, that's not going to work. The reason conservative ideas lost is because conservative ideas don't really do the things that people at these places need their ideas to do. I mean, they're just worse in the sense of, like, what do I get out of holding these ideas? And this is a perspective that comes pretty foreign to people, but that they should actually think about more. Like, what do I gain? Not necessarily in dollars and cents, but in social advancement, access to mates, whatever. What do I gain from holding these ideas? How will they help me?
Yeah, one of the one of the things that has happened as America has connected and become more centralized is the clear distinction between patrons and constituents has broken down, and so people tend to less understand like regional politicians as people who are securing something for them and their family, and see them as like champions of an idea or ideology that will then rule the empire. And so it, and in fact, not only is that occurred, that's of course very much encouraged because it obfuscates the actual mechanisms operating. And so it is very difficult, almost I think to the point of impossibility, to convince like your average mainstream kind of Republican type voter that is actually how they should view the interaction. I don't even know that people who've been steeped in the civic religion their entire lives have really the ability to access some of that. But I guess you're trying to make it clear to the next generation that is how that functions.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the commenters said, well, you can't really deny that CRT is an anti-white ideology. That's just silly. And to sort of tie this into what we just said, like, if you're a conservative or on the right or some sort of neo-reactionary, maybe a good question to ask is sort of what the fuck do I actually get out of holding an ideology or an idea? If you're a white person, like, sure, I can't deny that CRT is anti-white. But what I will say is that if you are a random American upper middle class white person, CRT, for all of its anti-whiteness, offers you a whole host of benefits that, being some sort of, I don't know, white nationalist or whatever does not. Benefit number one, you actually get to hate poor people without feeling bad about it. You even get to hate poor Black people without feeling bad about it. If you have a bit of chutzpah, you can straight up tell your sort of illegal Guatemalan maid that she's a horrible racist and you're going to fire her or not, give her back her passport because she hasn't internalized, like, anti-colonialism or whatever. And people actually do that. Like, that's benefit number one. You actually get to sort of have a real outlet for ethnic hatred, and not just against white people, by the way. That, if you're a white nationalist, you're going to get fired. Benefit number two, like, this is a necessary ideology to advance inside of institutions. I wouldn't say like, oh, well, I'm white, but I hate myself. It's even a drawback because these people, they don't hate themselves. And this is benefit number three. They hate all of you in the comments. That's it. And again, because you in the comments who say, well, CRT is anti-white, you've just sort of declared yourself to be, useless and evil human beings. A white person who follows this ideology has carte blanche to hate you as much as they want. Like, if they want to organize some sort of fucking fox hunt where you're not hunting foxes, but hillbillies or whatever, or bad people, they can do that. Like, I'm not even saying that as some sort of metaphor here. I'm saying that if you actually want to punch a Nazi or something, like, the cops will protect you.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen plenty of that. So I think that those are all good points, and I think that those are all things for people to keep in mind as they are attacking this issue. I see Joseph Lopez there. Sorry, I can't read that comment again. I do want to keep the channel monetized, but thank you for your donation. And I think Malcolm did answer your concern there kind of with his response. And then there was another one that came in. Let me see what I can do. Let's see. Polish ambassador here. Thank you for your donation. Revolution is an Enlightenment term submerged in expectations, methodology, and most importantly, crowd of it. The term you're looking for is rebellion. Yeah, I guess we can quibble over that.
Yeah, I would accept rebellion. Like, as long as you don't think that you are some sort of like inside the tent pissing out at the barbarians trying to tear down the tent, but actually the people who are actually inside the tent think you are a barbarian who is threatening to piss inside of it. Like, fine, you can call it a rebellion or a revolution or whatever. Like, just don't lie to yourself about which side you're on.
Yeah, no, and I do think that that's important, and this is one of the. While I don't think, again, you're going to get like the majority of mainstream Republicans to understand this, I do see a shift in a lot of kind of the slightly outside of the tent right-wing thought leaders. You do see some of these outlets that are gaining respect and getting into kind of the intellectual sphere of the right are kind of preaching points near this. So I do think there is some shift there, and that filters down eventually. I also think that one of the reasons that this has struck so many people, one of the reasons this has become the flashpoint and actually gotten more movement than the average thing is CRT is about as close as the average American has come to kind of glimpsing the ruling ideology.
Yeah.
And having a name for it. Like, they can name the demon and have something to look for.
Yeah. And so I think that to sort of split the difference here, like, I think that Curtis Jarvin, in all of his sort of points on the uselessness of the conservative activist approach, like, I don't think any significant point there is necessarily incorrect. And again, as we sort of went over earlier, like, if you're going to bet against something, you should always bet against conservatism, because that way you rarely, if ever, lose. But that being said, the issue here is kind of that the liberals, the enemy in this case, they're sort of collapsing under their own contradictions, and they will do so regardless of what the right does. The right can sort of have a plan to react to that, and they can speed this along, and they can organize their own sort of polity and all of that stuff. But sooner or later, Humpty Dumpty is going to sort of fall off the wall on his own. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that sort of American society today is reaching the limits of like what you can actually improve by making things more expensive and more complex.
Yeah, the question, I guess, is, can elites continue what they're doing by further globalizing, right? Like, that's the hack, right? Is seeking outside the country ways to do this. I know that doesn't solve the problem; it simply pushes everything down the line. But that is the trick, right? If they can pull that off.
Yeah, I think that's kind of doubtful for a lot of reasons. Number one is sort of that if you look at all of these improvements in technology that allowed for globalization, what they ended up being was sort of improvements in technology that allowed you to streamline or effectivize things like logistics, say. So instead of, making clothes in the US and selling them in the US, you can make them in Malaysia or whatever, and then rely on this well-oiled, super efficient machine of international transportation to sort of get things where they need to be on the dot. But the problem with efficient systems is that they have absolutely no, they have no reserves. They have no margins. Once you implement a just-in-time system, the moment a container ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal, for example, everything kind of fucks up. And there's not a lot of sort of room to effectivize things further. So again, what the US has created is an incredibly fragile system that a couple of major shocks would just send into a huge tailspin. And again, it's a process you can only go through once. You can sort of close down all the factories in the US and place them somewhere else, but you can't really close them down twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, the like I think that, like, if I'm being honest here, like, maybe one of the reasons that Jarvin is a bit more sanguine than I am, and doesn't really, I think, I don't know if he would take this sort of limits of complexity argument seriously, but I mean, the guy's a sort of longtime member of Silicon Valley, and he came of age at the time where this was still the standard bearer of like human progress, a promise for a new sort of better future. But I mean, how many people actually believe that about Silicon Valley today, in the year of our Lord 2021? Like, how many people actually believe that if I just gave Silicon Valley $5 trillion, like, they'd come up with such wonders that my life would be drastically improved? I don't think there's a lot of those people around, because what Silicon Valley can do is they can take something you already have, like your bookshelf, and then they can, you know, make your bookshelf sell all your secret information to the Chinese and have you pay for the pleasure of that. That's it.
Yeah, but we've done a pretty good job of kind of making people forget what they lost and tell them that basically because they can do that, if this process wasn't occurring, they'd basically be living in like mud huts, right? Like that's kind of the narrative we sell to people, is like, if it wasn't for this Whig history, you know, infinite progress, long arc, you know, explanation of our society, then you just be treading light fire with stones. And I would say there's almost all of the population believe that, even if the message gets more and more hollow every year. And so eventually it does break down because it's simply not enough. I do agree with you there. It's just there's still tread on that tire, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, sure. I would agree with that, at least to a fairly significant extent, that there's tread on that tire, but every month and every year it gets thinner and thinner. And the people that really do believe have this sort of almost panicked tenor in their voice, in the same sense that, you know, people saying, you know, the Soviet Union, we will bury you, like capitalism will fail in 1979, weren't necessarily saying that with like smug confidence, but a sort of growing sense of unease.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem here is just that, like, once Silicon Valley loses this last shreds of, you know, we will come up with some magic fancy gimmick that will make everything better, like, where are you going to send the money to? Like the Pentagon, Princeton? Like, there's nobody left that promises some sort of massive improvement. If you could only have them sort of make the American system more complex and like more costly. And this is one of the things I think is kind of a risk of coping, which some people end up falling into, where they say that, oh, well, you know, I really hate these liberals. Like, they're all spawn of Satan and they worship devils and all of that crap, right? But man, aren't they impressive? So these liberals that I hate and that are evil, they're about to crush the Roman Republic, and then we're going to have a liberal Roman American empire for 400 years or whatever. And I really hate that, but man, it's going to be impressive. Like, no. There's no room to expand from, you know, a American sort of republic into an American empire that just, you know, grows more impressive and like has its time in the sun. In a lot of ways, it's so obvious that if you look at the sort of strongholds of the liberal model or whatever, like, these places are fucking falling apart, like literally falling apart.
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like you're in a kind of a case study of Spangler's late winter civilization. Like, just everything is, all the metaphysical energy is bled out of kind of the civilization, and you're just everything's sclerotic. The institutions can't bear the weight anymore, and
Yeah.
you can just kind of feel it groaning.
Yeah, and the places that are most like that are places where, Team Blue is the strongest. Like, that's undeniable. Like, look at Los Angeles, look at San Francisco. Like, these places are just. I mean, at some point in the near future, you can probably make the trip from like the worst places of San Fran to like an average African urban slum and go, man, like I really like having 40% less feces on the street. Like these African slums, like when are we going to get them in the US? When are we going to get these African slums in California? I would really like the improvement that offers. It's the problem people that call themselves conservatives or neo-reactionaries or whatever have to deal with at the end of the day. It's not necessarily like, how do we survive in this gay transgender Soviet Union that will last for 1,000 years? It's, what are we going to do when this gay transgender Soviet Union that barely works as it is runs into a bump in the road and collapses into 1,000 pieces, and nobody is tasked with the job of making sure there's gas in the gas station anymore? Like that's up to the individual. Like, what am I going to do then? Because that's a more serious problem than the Soviet Union lasting for 1,000 years. As painful as that would be, it actually collapsing in front of you promises to bring more acute pain.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys. Well, I think we're going to get close to wrapping this up. If you have any questions for Malcom or I, now's the time. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you wanted to get to, Malcom?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so make sure that you are checking him out on Twitter. And like I said, we are discussing primarily essay he just published on his blog. So if you want to read the whole thing in its entirety, and I suggest that you do, I think there's a lot of wisdom in there, then go ahead and follow the links that are below the video. You can definitely check that out. Thank you, everybody, for coming by. We had a lot of people watching, so we really appreciate it, guys. And let's go ahead. Yeah, I think that's everything.
Yeah,
all right.
Thanks.
All right. So thanks for coming on, Malcom. And as always, guys, I'll talk to you next time.